Good evening and welcome to a Monday night edition of Tisky Sour. I'm Michael Walker and I hope you have all enjoyed a very peaceful weekend inside, I suppose, for at least 23 hours for each of the days. I am joined this evening by Novara Media co-founder and contributing editor Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm good. I was soaking up the rays in our little back garden. I know that not everybody has that privilege, of course.
You're one of the lucky ones, Aaron. Don't rub it in our face. I've got a little balcony, so it's fine. I don't get many angles, but what can you do? I'm also joined by Ash Sarkar, contributing editor at Novara Media and all-round superstar. How are you doing?
I'm good. I feel very pleased to be amongst such handsome company. You're both looking svelte, clean, pristine, and on the dean. Looking great, guys.
I like that rhyme. Tonight we are talking about Boris Johnson coming back as Prime Minister after a few weeks off the job. Fair enough. He had coronavirus. Can't complain. We are also going to be talking about the revolving door that exists between the British press corps and government. We're going to talk a bit about Priti Patel, and we're also going to talk about the right-wing drive to try and end the lockdown early. First of all, you're watching Tisky Sour. We want you to tweet on the hashtag Tisky Sour because we like more people to find out about this show. Come to find us. Also share the show link. First story, Boris is back. Today was the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's first day back at work since being treated in intensive care for COVID-19. Today he gave a brief speech in Downing Street to mark the occasion.
If this virus were a physical assailant, an unexpected and invisible mugger, which I can tell you from personal experience it is, then this is the moment when we have begun together to wrestle it to the floor.
Boris Johnson is one of those politicians where you know that half the country are listening to him thinking like, what an idiot. How the hell is he the Prime Minister? And half the country think like, oh, is it nice to hear Boris back with fighting talk after he was sick in hospital? Were you reassured to hear Boris Johnson's fighting talk? He's saying that coronavirus is like a mugger that's been wrestled to the floor and we've almost succeeded.
I mean, this is some vintage Toryism, right? So if you go back and you read that seminal Stuart Hall text, Policing the Crisis, it's all about that 1970s, 1980s moral panic of the mugger and the way in which it imported a US moral panic to the UK, and it provided a kind of racialized understanding of social crime. But that's neither here nor there. I just thought it was sort of, vintage Thatcherism, and I was a bit like, ooh, I get the reference.
Tories just love talking about muggers.
They just they're obsessed with muggers. I mean, London's a pretty safe city for a city of its size. It's sort of
it is at the moment because there's no one on the streets.
But catering to the audience in the home counties, the idea of this sort of dirty plague-ridden city where people come up and snatch your phone at the drop of a hat. But the personification of disease is always a really interesting thing. And Susan Sontag writes about it in Illness as a Metaphor, because what it does is when you personify disease is that it gets you thinking about, dangerous, dirty, and contagious people. And for the Tories, it's a way of slipping out of the noose of having to think about the cuts that they've imposed, the NHS in particular, but also across the social care sector, which has created this circumstance that we have in the UK, where in order for the NHS to not collapse, they've essentially had to abandon care homes and elderly people. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing the kind of mortality figures that we're seeing now, and into the realm of law and order with a bit of tough talk, and it instantly reassures people. So while the mugger analogy was silly, I think that it did serve an ideological purpose. It does hark back to that tradition of thinking of illness as a metaphor. And even if he's not aware of it himself, that kind of vintage policing the crisis era ideology.
Well, that was a great angle I hadn't thought of. And neither had Britain's political editors, as we'll get on to in a moment. First of all, I want to say later on in the speech, he talked about how Britain had defied predictions because we had not run out of ventilators and ICU beds, as you just intimated towards there. She didn't obviously, however, mention the 40,000 death toll so far. You might remember that the chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, said late in March that if there were 20,000 deaths, that would count as a success. That is one prediction we have defied. Of course, his mere presence was enough to have much of the mainstream media swooning. We're going to go to some of the choice examples here. So this was the BBC front page yesterday. Coronavirus, Boris Johnson's return to work, a boost for the country. Now, if that was on the front of the Daily Mail or the Sun, I'd find it a bit distasteful, but I'd accept it. The fact that is the front page of what is supposed to be our impartial broadcast, a headline that would make Pyongyang proud, is, pretty difficult to take. We can also look at Sky News. So they sent their star presenter Kay Burley to cover the speech, the one of which you just saw a small chunk now. This was her analysis. So heavy is the head that wears the crown. Talking about how difficult it must be to have all of this power and prestige, and also talking about him like he's king. But in case you thought all of this hagiography, the religious hagiography, would remain somewhat implicit, this was Laura Kuenssberg's description of Johnson's comeback. So coronavirus, Johnson clear there will be no sudden nirvana. So apparently a few days in ICU has transformed Boris Johnson not only from the nation's political leader, but also into a spiritual one. He is sort of a bumbling blonde Buddha. I'm going to bring you in, Aaron. What do you make of all of this? We've talked a lot on this show about the servile press and how they cover politics as if it's like a soap opera. But do you think they reach new heights today in terms of inanity?
Possibly. I thought the Nirvana line was quite interesting, and the mugger line, of course, is very useful because talking in metaphors, which whether you like him or not, whether you agree with him politically or not, and obviously I think the three of us, it's pretty clear where our political sympathies lie. He is exquisitely good at talking in metaphors and talking in very evoking sort of a language which can resonate with a significant chunk of the population very quickly. Not all of them, like you said, it turns many people off too, but that's something which Keir Starmer, for any other gifts he has, any other advantages he has as a politician or as a potential leader of a party, I don't think he has that. And that's the thing we shouldn't actually mock. It's a powerful talent to have. Jeremy Corbyn didn't really have it. The last Labour leader to have it probably was Tony Blair. And it's not necessarily, he's not speaking in the register of the working person, but he can find these words. I remember once he was talking about broadband being like rice vermicelli going under the, it's kind of poetic in a way. And you have to admire it. In terms of the reception by the media class, you see what Kay Burley's saying or Laura Kuenssberg. People watching this, whether you're watching it live or whether you're listening to it on the podcast or watching it later, you think, who the hell are these people? And the frank reality is, particularly senior journalists working at the BBC, working at Sky, but also some print outlets, they live in a completely different universe. We'll talk about this probably later on the show because of another story. These are people on several £100,000. They live in multi-million-pound properties in London. When they go to the high street, all the shops are full. Everybody's working. Well, not so much now, but, until a few months ago, high levels of employment, people getting on with life, multiculturalism in all its glory, all the best things about Britain right now, really, ticking over nicely. They are completely detached from the rest of Britain. High streets in breakdown, high levels of underemployment, in-work poverty, people struggling to get to a minimum wage job, taking 2-3 buses to get there first thing in the morning. They have no idea. And I think it's something we really have to focus on. It's not all journalists, but there is this sediment at the top of British political journalism, which is as detached from reality as people like Boris Johnson are.
Mm. And it is odd to say because obviously, we've always been very clear on this show that we want, it's no one's lucky to come down with coronavirus, and anyone who falls sick from it, we want to get better as soon as possible. But there is a sense in which it, from a PR perspective, it was kind of helpful for Boris Johnson that he was out of the game precisely in that moment when our death toll was getting, quite so bad. And when it, when the UK was becoming Italy, basically, with all of that warning. Now sort of the death toll is subsiding somewhat. He gets to come back after, being genuinely sick. I'm not a conspiracy theorist here. He was genuinely sick and he was in the ICU. And now the BBC is sort of like, oh, he can come back. And the story isn't, maybe we should seriously reassess Boris Johnson's strategy and ask him difficult questions. It's just to say, oh, isn't it good that he's come back? It really lifts the country. It's a boost for the country that Boris Johnson has returned to work. And everyone is sort of treating him with child gloves. And I can see why you might do that in an ordinary job. When someone comes back from hospital, you're particularly sensitive towards them, or maybe you don't give them the most difficult task because you're trying to ease them into the job. But I mean, he's the prime minister, right? I mean, different rules have to apply.
I mean, I think that, it's obviously really good that he's out of the ICU. I'm sure his family are really relieved, but unless he's up for doing all of the job straight away coming back, and that includes the much more difficult 5 p.m. conference, don't be faffing about on the lectern, fielding softball questions and getting no questions, but getting praised as next to the second coming of Christ himself. That's not what I want from a prime minister, and that's certainly not what I want from a prime minister in the middle of the most severe peacetime crisis that we have experienced really for at least a century. And I think when it comes to the social meaning of illness, there's something which is really interesting, because Aaron, you picked up on it a few weeks ago, is when Iranian health ministers got sick, it was a symbol of a failing state in the West. When people in China got sick, it was seen as symptomatic of cultural backwardness, of uncleanliness, of eating weird foods, and then, political failures of the Chinese government. And then when the virus comes to Britain and it is tearing through our care homes, it was left to spread unchecked through our society right up until March. And when our health minister, our chief medical officer, our prime minister, and his most senior advisor all get sick, in fact, what that becomes a symbol of is how democratic we are, and the fact that we are actually all in it together. And all of that happens right at the same time as the media goes into overdrive, using those, telescopic lenses to compress images to make it look like there are irresponsible crowds of people out there spreading the virus. So one, you've got cultural exceptionalism. The meaning of the illness is exceptional in our culture. But then even at the same time, that disconnect between the meaning of illness when it affects elites and the meaning of illness when it's sort of transposed into ordinary people is completely hypocritical. And if we had a media culture with one molecule of critical capacity within them, these kinds of hypocrisies would be pointed out.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that we, that was made. Was it by Aaron, or I can't remember? As you say, it was by Aaron. I was thinking it was by you, but it was this idea that when the Iranian health minister fell down sick, it was a symbol of a failed state. And when our prime minister falls sick, it's a symbol of how egalitarian and democratic we are. Aaron, do you want a final point on Boris Johnson coming back before we go to our next story?
No, I just thought, what clip that up, what Ash just said was remarkable. You nailed it in 60 seconds.
I get it all from you, cuz.
Right. We're going to move on to our next story now. If you're enjoying what you're watching, please tweet on the hashtag TiskiSao with your comments. Some of your questions, we'll ask those as we go through the show as well. Share the show link. We want to get more people watching this. Okay, next story is the right-wing push to end the lockdown early. Now, we've talked about how Boris Johnson has been treated with kid gloves, how his speech didn't say that much, and how it was potentially a bit inappropriate to sort of talk about how successful Britain's strategy has been when 40,000 people have died. But, and I don't normally do this, you have to give him a little bit of credit for what he actually said. And that's because he pushed back actually against the idea that we should immediately end the lockdown. And there are some pretty powerful people in pretty powerful places who are pushing for this to happen right now. Most notably, they seem to hang around the Daily Telegraph. And so throughout this crisis, this has been most notable on their comment pages, and particularly with neo-Thatcherites like Daniel Hannan. I want to show you a headline from a comment piece he did back on the 11th of April. So to contextualize this, this was the day after it was announced that 980 people had died in a 24-hour period, when we were all sort of, talking about how serious this was, how tragic this was, Daniel Hannan was penning this. It's time to start loosening the lockdown. It beggars belief. Okay, but this push has now made it from the comment pages to the front pages. The front pages are obviously more important for obvious reasons, but it's also, you see when something has become political common sense that it makes it from the comment section to the news section, and that's happening now. So on the front page this morning, the Telegraph had a headline about Boris Johnson being, preparing to ease a lockdown and all the pressure there was for that. But unsurprisingly, even though this is, supposed to be news, not comment, it relied on quite a lot of misleading statements and misrepresentation. This particularly pertains to them sort of exaggerating public support for an ending of the lockdown. I want to go to a quote from that front page now. So in the Telegraph, they write, an opinion poll published on Sunday showed that the public is increasingly supportive of a staggered exit from the lockdown, with more than half of people wanting restaurants, offices, shopping centres and schools to reopen as soon as new infections decrease, though a majority want sports stadiums to remain closed until there is a vaccine. Now you read that, and any sensible person reading that would think, oh, people are desperate for this lockdown to end. They want to reopen all of these unessential places, restaurants, offices, shopping centres, as soon as new infections decrease. And to be honest, we already know that new infections do potentially seem to be decreasing. That doesn't necessarily mean it's stable or that's a long-term thing, but right now that appears to be happening, right? The problem, this is a complete misrepresentation of what people actually told the pollster, right? So the question only gave one option, which was more pro-lockdown than the one that, we would reopen these institutions when infections decrease. So let's look at what the actual poll said. So asked about offices, only 18% think that once cases go down, we should open offices as usual, right? 55%, a much bigger number, think we should, but only with monitoring and restrictions. 11% want to wait until we have a vaccine. We can also look at restaurants. So only 13% want them to reopen as usual once cases go down. 55% think they should, but only with monitoring and restrictions. 21% think that we should wait until a vaccine has been found to open restaurants. That's 18 months, right? And you can see here there's two huge problems with the Telegraph's framing. So first, these people aren't just saying they want them to be opened, right? They're saying opened with restrictions and with monitoring. This is not people who are gagging for everything to go back to normal, as the Telegraph headline writers seem to be hoping for. Second, if you're only given two options, which is open them when infections start to fall with restrictions, or wait until a vaccine, then the moderate position is to open them when infections fall with some restrictions, because waiting until a vaccine, I don't think we should wait until a vaccine to reopen the economy, but I'm not gagging for an end to the lockdown, right? Aaron, I'm going to go to you. I mean, what do you think is behind this, often quite transparent, but very manipulative attempt to basically misrepresent public opinion to try and make it look as if there is a drive to end the lockdown when, no such swell in public opinion exists?
Yeah, it's just remarkable, isn't it? I don't know if it was that data, but there was perhaps another set of data which indicated that I think 60% plus of people were effectively very happy for the lockdown to continue as is.
I'm going to interrupt you actually, because we can get that data up, and then I'll go to your proper comment. So this was YouGov today. It's even more sort of striking piece of data than there was in that Telegraph poll I just pointed out. So they asked an even more sort of conservative question, which is, would you like to see a plan to end the lockdown? So not even would you like to end the lockdown now, but would you like to see the plan? And only 32% of the public even want to see a plan to end the lockdown now, let alone actually end it. 63% think the government should wait until the situation is clearer before coming up with an exit strategy. So sorry I interrupted you. I just wanted to get those stats on the screen because you referred to them.
Yeah, it's really helpful. And what you heard repeatedly, I think yesterday I was listening to Westminster Hour.
On purpose.
On purpose. I don't know why I did that. I then tweeted about Lucy Powell, and it got loads of retweets. And then she said apparently I was dogpiling her, even though I literally repeated her words back to her without tagging her. And they were saying the sort of tenor of the comment you were hearing on that show was, people are getting restless. People want to sort of see an end to the lockdown. This is the most popular policy of the last decade. This is an incredibly popular set of measures. It's not popular because people want to do it. It's popular because people know it has to be done. Because we've seen 20, possibly 40,000 plus people die despite the lockdown. If we hadn't done it, it'd obviously be significantly worse. You know, the ballpark figures are 250,000 to 500,000 people dying if we did nothing at all. And so I agree with you, Mike. It's just another sort of instance of this is just completely detached from reality. At least with the Boris Johnson stuff, it channels certain national myths, you know, of the sovereign, of a certain class deference, which does pervade British society. I get that. But this is just a complete, you know, complete detachment from reality. And what was really interesting was some of those numbers about, for instance, basically half of people don't want stadiums and nightclubs to reopen until we get a vaccine. You're saying 18 months. I mean, it could be, I mean, I think a more realistic number is 3 years. By the time you produce it, actually physically produce them, roll them out, everybody has a vaccine, right? We need tens of millions of doses. I think it's perfectly fair to say 3 years, 2 years, 3 years. In which case, you know, that's 50% of people don't think we should basically have Premier League football. They don't think we should have people going to nightclubs. I mean, really significant for large parts of the economy.
I mean, 3 years. I was just thinking maybe Spurs will have sorted out their back line by then. So
I mean, that's well, I mean, the match. Well, this is the interesting thing. You know, I go through Google News, and you see sort of transfer gossip and this player's going there, this player's going there. Are you kidding me? The second biggest source of revenue for football club is gate receipts, and that might not be coming back for a couple of years. So it's just like, you know, there's stuff that people just take for granted, going back to usual. This is huge. And what's really striking, I'll finish with this, is that every woman, every man on the street seems to be more in tune with that than political editors and people writing for the front pages of our national media. And it's really, really striking. You have to ask why.
I mean, so I think I could take a punt at why. The editorial direction of The Telegraph and The Spectator as well makes a lot more sense when you realise that who they're writing for is a handful of maybe 100, 150 people concentrated around SW1. And that's who they want to influence. And they wield public opinion a bit like a mallet to batter those people into doing what they want. But ultimately, that's their audience. And you would look at what's happening now. It's not damaging the Conservatives in the polls really one bit. You do have a decline in the percentage of people who think the government are doing well, but it's still above 50% most of the time. And you've still got relatively high approval ratings for Boris Johnson. But what's getting chipped away is the core of their ideology. And the core of their ideology, which says that it's fine for significant portions of the workforce to be living precarious lives, paycheck to paycheck, often getting themselves into debt just to cover the basics of living expenses. Well, that's gone out the window when you've got a 3-month mortgage holiday. You've got conversations going on about reductions in rent payments and deferrals of rent payments. And you've also got, very grateful society towards those on that sort of low wage frontline work in a way that you haven't seen for very many years. You've got huge numbers of people turning towards universal credit as a source of income support. Now, universal credit being an utterly miserable experience, which would drive people into penury, starvation, and even suicide. Well, that's okay when that's not your core voters. When you've got more and more numbers of people who were self-employed, white collar, doing all right for themselves, who are now turning to universal credit, which is a system designed itself as punishment for the crime of being poor, then you've got another problem. And then going forward, you've got, what I like to think of as the Churchill problem. Right? The Churchill problem is being a very good wartime leader, but because you've overseen a system of government which demonstrates that it's possible for a government to centrally plan and run an economy during a state of emergency, during wartime, is that it then undermines the claim that the government shouldn't have a role in the economy in peacetime, so outside of that state of emergency. And I think that this is where Keir Starmer is trying to position himself, but unfortunately he doesn't have a Bevan yet at his side, he's supplying those big ideas that he could then put into action. So he's got the soft left, sort of technical procedural bit down, but he needs those big ideas. Because a time like now, and this is what I think Rishi Sunak is very worried about, this is what I think Dominic Cummings is very worried about, this is what I think arch Thatcherites like Daniel Hannan and Toby Young are very worried about, is that you've normalized the idea that the state can take a major role in planning the economy, a major role in supplementing people's incomes, and that the collective good is more important than individual success and endeavor. So you've got the heart of their ideology being demolished day by day. And that's why they're so worried about the lockdown continuing, because the longer it goes on, the more their foundational way of thinking is just crumbling away under their feet.
I can't believe the crude Marxists at Novara Media haven't yet said that it's just rich bastards that want to make some short-term profit. Because whilst I think, your answers were way more sophisticated than that, the Sunday Times suggested it might be a bit more crude than we've all been thinking. I want to go to this article from the Sunday Times. They led with the story, Tory grandees tell PM it's time to ease the coronavirus lockdown. Now, looking at the headline, you might think that's, ex-prime ministers, big dogs in the government, people who, care about the long-term ideology of conservatism, the kind of thing that Ash has just been talking about. But actually, it just turns out to be real rich people, right? Rich people with no political, pedigree whatsoever. Let's go to the first quote from that piece. So the billionaire financier Michael Spencer, a big donor to Johnson's leadership campaign last year, said, "We should start loosening up the lockdown as soon as we reasonably can and allow the economy to start moving forward. We should really begin to offer a narrative of how and when it's going to stop." Steve Morgan, the former boss of the house builder Redrow, who gave £1 million to the Conservative general election campaign, said, "We're actually endangered at the medicine, if you want to call the lockdown that, is more harmful than the cure." Now, some of our viewers who follow American politics or have watched, our previous shows with, great guests like Michael Brooks or Sarah Jaffe will maybe remember this comment as being from Donald Trump. So Donald Trump has repeated this so many times. We can't let the medicine be worse. We can't let the medicine be worse than the disease, or the cure be worse than the disease, whatever the particular phrase is. I think they both say it slightly different. We're in danger of the medicine is more harmful than the cure. Apologies. Now, he is saying this specifically because against all scientific and medical advice, what he wants to do is get the economy moving super quickly, however many lives it costs, because he is desperate for the stock market to go up by November, because he thinks that's going to be, what wins him the presidency, and also because he's obviously in the pockets of America's billionaire class. Now, you've got people who have given £1 million to the Conservative Party who are getting, big pieces on the front page of the Times, or big quotes on the front page of the Times, saying exactly the same thing. So, I mean, this is worrying, to say the least. We're going to go to a couple of tweets on the hashtag TiskiSour before going to our next story. Lion and Fox 81 tweets on the hashtag TiskiSour. Right wingers are talking about ending lockdown because they believe the death toll has been pushed up by the government. I have been arguing with these nutters for days. They wholeheartedly believe COVID-19 is no worse than the flu. These people are dangerous. Also, that's a comment. I haven't actually seen many of those on my Twitter feed. That's people who think that the death toll has been actively exaggerated. Oh, actually, I say that, but that's what Andrew Neil.
Andrew Neil thinks that.
Yeah, sorry. I was thinking this was just conspiracy theorists on the internet, but Andrew Neil is always saying that it's people who just died with COVID-19.
Don't you find it interesting that Andrew Neil is the kind of person, when they talk about victims of communism in the numbers, the people that died because of communism, they include the Wehrmacht. They include, I'm being serious, they include sort of war casualties during the Second World War when Russia helped defeat Nazi Germany. Somebody who would include those within victims of communism will at the same time say that a nurse who died with coronavirus, age 30, well, she died with coronavirus. We can't really attribute causation to it. I mean, come on. It's just. I know the guy said he was to the right of Thatcher. I know he was Murdoch's Rottweiler at the Sunday Times. But even this is ridiculous.
But I mean, this is something which I remember we've talked about before in this show, which is we have a language for thinking about the ways in which different illnesses interact. And so that's why when you take a disease like AIDS, for instance, where the majority of people who do die because of AIDS, it's usually pneumonia and some kind of lung infection, you still say that the cause of death was an AIDS-related illness because you can talk about the way in which different illnesses interact. So if you're a patient who has got various different comorbidities, so maybe you've got a compromised immune system, or maybe you're undergoing cancer treatment, maybe you're recovering from surgery, and you die with coronavirus because having your lung capacity reduced by, in some cases, 50% wasn't really good for helping you recover from the other shit going on. You actually have a way of saying the coronavirus played a significant role in this person's death. It wasn't the only thing going on, but played a significant role. So it's not the gotcha that Andrew Neil thinks it is. You talk to anyone who works in medicine. Admittedly, that's not me, to the perpetual disappointment of my mother. But having spoken to people who do work, on respiratory wards, they're like, yeah, this is actually really straightforward. Don't know why these journalists are banging on about it all the time.
They're overthinking it for a reason, because they want to get the economy started, because, as you say, they're worried that it's undermining some of their neoliberal beliefs. And also there's some billionaires who are losing some opportunity to profit. We've got another tweet from Liam Clark. Until we're at the bottom of the peak and there's a proper test, trace, isolate program in place, the lockdown shouldn't ease at all. It's an interesting point. There's a big debate going on at the moment between, do you want no transmission or do you just want the R to be below 1? We've had this conversation on previous shows, so we probably won't go into it in too much depth today, but very interesting point. We have 1,700 people watching this. We only have 600 likes. We want to get at least to over 1,000 whilst we are still live. And it'd also be great to get to 2,000 viewers. So again, if you'd like to share this link, please do. We always want to get more people on the live stream. Our next story is about a cabinet minister who we haven't talked about that much on this show so far, because for the first few weeks of this crisis, she was somewhat hidden from view. So I'm talking about Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. Now, you would have seen the array of government ministers who they put out in interviews day after day after day. They've become very familiar faces, even to people who don't really follow politics. Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, Michael Gove, the Chancellor of the Duchy, or Chancellor of Lancaster. It's always a very confusing title, that one. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary. These are always rolled out onto the Sunday shows and in those press conferences. Priti Patel wasn't. That was until 2 weeks ago when she was brought out for the first time after a hashtag campaign, hashtag Where's Priti Patel. And she only made her second appearance this weekend. And the appearance this weekend, we're going to go to that in a moment. But I mean, if you put the two together, it is safe to assume that the reason why Priti Patel was hidden for a while is because she has a tendency to put her foot in it. Or, I mean, that's almost being too harsh, because it's not that she says the wrong thing. It's that she sort of says things in such a crude way that it really displays the pathetic nature of the state. She doesn't have the subtleties to sort of dress it up as the others do. So let's, to refresh our memories, go back to the key moments from that first press conference. So this is the announcement she made 2 weeks ago to ensure us that the government was serious about addressing the incredibly damaging problem of increased domestic violence under the lockdown.
To help us all look out for those who need help, we have created a new campaign, and we have created a symbol of hope, a handprint embossed with a heart, so that people can easily show that we will not tolerate abuse as a society. I ask you, and I urge everyone, to share this on social media or in the windows of your own homes, just to demonstrate how much we care and how much our country cares.
I mean, we talk a lot on this show about how neoliberalism has made the state kind of useless and pathetic, and why that has really hampered their ability, or the state's ability, to deal with COVID-19. And I think the fact that she has created a logo to deal with domestic abuse, displays that more than anything. That wasn't the only moment in that press conference, though, where it was clear that, the state just wasn't up to the job. So she was asked a question about PPE and whether she was embarrassed or ashamed, and that the government hadn't fulfilled a basic function of getting people on the front line enough equipment to keep themselves safe. This was her answer then.
No apology, Home Secretary, for these failings which NHS staff and their families blame on the government.
Well, I'm sorry if people feel that there have been failings. I'll be very, very clear about that. But at the same time, we are in an unprecedented global health pandemic right now. It is inevitable that the demand and the pressures on PPE and the demand for PPE are going to be exponential. They're going to be incredibly high. And of course, we are trying to address that as a government. And I think that is right. That is our priority.
So the state, according to Priti Patel, can either design you a logo, or if it fails to get you basic goods, it will say sorry for how you feel.
No. It wasn't sorry for how you feel. It was, I'm sorry you feel that way.
Yeah,
it was a completely different tone. It was a completely different tone. It was irritation followed by remembering what it is she's actually supposed to say. So it was actually so much more dysfunctional than how it is you described it. But just very, very quickly on the domestic violence issue, because I've been talking to people who work in social work, and I've been wondering, how do you do your job? How do you deal with the fact that you've got an increase in incidences, you've got a narrowing of avenues available for victims to come forward and seek support, and you've also got fewer opportunities for things like community welfare checks. And one of the things that's been found by people who are working on the front line of social work is that you've got an increase in numbers of people calling the helplines, especially ones which are run by charities, but an overall decrease in referrals being made. So you do have a sense that there are increased instances of domestic violence and, far fewer cases of victims of violence able to leave households in which they're in danger. And there are many reasons for this. One is fewer opportunities to leave. Two is being worried about coronavirus, being worried about what you're exposing yourself to, what you're exposing your children to. And three, not knowing where it is you're going to be placed, whether it's going to be, one of the god-awful B&Bs that councils often have to rely on for emergency temporary accommodation, whether it would be something that you could conceivably live in for quite some time because of the ongoing lockdown. So it's a really thorny issue. And, any Home Secretary would be hard pushed to answer a question and come up with a coherent policy, which is, you can anyway meet the scale of the issue that's in front of them, and you would have some sympathy for that. But what Priti Patel has done is, it's like downloading half a Wikipedia article to try and show that you did your homework, but you haven't really. It's even more pathetic than just owning up and saying, this is a huge problem. And it's a huge problem because we cut our social services to ribbons, because our domestic violence refuges are underfunded. They've also been struggling with changes because of housing benefit. The charity sector isn't joined up with local authorities all that well when it comes to identifying at-risk people and giving them the help they need. Instead, she was like, we did an emblem just to look like work was being done, and that's something I've got scorn for.
I'm going to go to you in a second, Aaron, but first of all, I want to bring us up to the present day, because in Saturday's press conference, again, Priti Patel excelled in demonstrating, the complete uselessness, not just of this particular government, but of the British state, right? So she took the opportunity to celebrate a drop in certain crime figures. Let's take a look.
Now, provisional data from police shows a fall in overall crime during this coronavirus outbreak. Car crime, burglary and shoplifting are all lower than the same period from this time last year.
Now, Priti, why might burglary, car crime and shoplifting have gone down in this period? So I was thinking, when I was planning this show, maybe we should get a criminologist on and we should talk in depth about what it is that affects rates of shoplifting and burglary and car crime. But then I realized, no, I'm just going to use my common sense, right? Shoplifting goes down when all the shops are closed. Burglary goes down when everyone's in their houses. And car crime goes down when everyone's cars are parked outside their houses and they're in their houses. It's the idea that you could, as standing up in front of the nation, you're the Home Secretary. It's one of the most important jobs in government. and you were there in the middle of a lockdown when literally all shops have been told they have to close, and boasting that shoplifting figures have gone down. I mean, Ash was talking about people, not doing their homework properly. I mean, her standing up there and saying, we should all be really grateful that shoplifting gone down is absolutely nuts. It's like killing half the population and saying murders have gone down. Aaron, I want to go to you. I know you love this topic of sort of like how neoliberalism has made the state completely useless. I mean, what do you make of Priti Patel, putting that all on show in these two press conferences?
Well, can you imagine what a sort of Minister of the Interior from China must think if they were to be shown that? And this is the British Home Secretary. I mean, they must think, sure, that's not possible. Really? This is the country which has the world's oldest and still largest public service broadcaster, employs thousands of people, the BBC, has one of the world's largest employers, the NHS, certainly the world's largest integrated healthcare system, has achieved innumerable bureaucratic and technological firsts, for better or worse, as a country. And the response to a massive rise in domestic violence is a campaign hinged around you drawing a heart on your hand. I mean, it just, there's these glimpses where you go, how the hell is, and I don't want to sort of channel as sort of, a nativist kind of, oh, Britain was this great, but it did lots of historic firsts. It just did, right? This tiny little island did a bunch of historic firsts. The first commercial airliner that was built it was a British jet. The world's first commercial nuclear reactor for civilian purposes was built in Britain, I think, in the early 1950s. These are really impressive achievements. The same state is asking people to draw a heart on their hand. I mean, this is the extent to which neoliberalism has just collapsed any state capacity, and problem solving has to go back to problem solving. Put the ideology to one side, put the politics to one side. How do you solve certain problems? Could be in-work poverty, could be homelessness, could be domestic violence, could be child poverty, whatever. These are problems we need to solve as a society, and they can't solve them. They can't solve them. The solutions are so absurd, they're actually increasingly ridiculous. They're funny. Another story, we talked about it last week, was Deloitte running one of the testing centers. Deloitte, they're accountants. This is like me asking Burger King to run psychotherapy for people who've been through trauma. It would be stupid. But the point is, there are people at the top of government who are, very close to senior directors and partners in Deloitte. So it happens, right? I mean, wow. You want a screwed up country? It means Deloitte are doing the testing for your healthcare services, and your Home Secretary is telling people to draw a heart on their hand. This is what you expect in a play school, not government.
And Deloitte also, it turns out, weren't, surprise, surprise, very good at doing testing. So it was the Deloitte Centre in Chessington World of Adventures where people had gone to get tests, and then they sent the results to the wrong people. I also just want to mention that I love it when you both do it. Is you sort of think, how would other countries see us, and how would we talk about other countries if this had happened there? And I think the shoplifting example is a really good one. It's like, when people talk about late stage Soviet communism, where they're like, oh, because it was all based on targets, it had these disincentives. So people would make loads of useless, crappy products, crappy shoes that didn't fit anyone because they had to meet the quota or whatever. The idea that, you would have a Home Secretary who would be boasting that shoplifting went down because she'd closed all the shops. I mean, even that you wouldn't believe if it was on like one of those. I'm watching Chernobyl at the moment, so it's full of these ideas that you've got all these disincentives. If it was in a show about a decrepit, declining empire, you wouldn't believe it. It would seem too on the nose.
If that was on a political satire show in Iran, the audience wouldn't believe it. I'm being deadly serious, but come on, the British, they had an empire that large. They're not this stupid. Come on,
my friend. Let me tell you something about the running of that empire. Sometimes it was dumb as fuck. I mean, the thing about what this government can get away with. Matt Zalb-Cousin, a friend of the show, loves to say the Conservatives can get away with playing politics on easy mode. And I think what we're seeing during this crisis is that, in particular, since Boris Johnson took over as leader of the party and as prime minister, that they're able to play it almost as a tutorial. So you've got these very senior journalists who are helping them along baby step by baby step, even sometimes supplying the very lines and the arguments that a government is simply too dumb to come up with themselves. And meanwhile, you've got staggering levels of venality, of incompetence, of outright stupidity. And in Boris Johnson's case, where he's, let this fucking edgy podcast dad dilettante, take over with tinkering, with the scientific levers of state policy. It's gambled with our lives. Now, any fourth estate worth its salt, and especially one which holds itself in as high as a regard as the Westminster lobby does for itself, should be pointing these things out. And instead, what we've got is, political editor of the BBC saying, look, Boris Johnson is being very mature, very reasonable here, very tough decisions. We're not going to get literal paradise on earth where everyone is immortal and there are songbirds and angels. He's being very reasonable. That's what that headline is. And sometimes I can't decide who's dumber, them for writing these headlines, them for coming up with this shitty journalism, or me for sitting here consuming it. I don't know which is the stupider thing.
All right, we're going to get, actually, that's a brilliant segue to our final story, which might give some clues as to why the mainstream media treat the Tories with kid gloves. First of all, a tweet. Jason Bournemouth tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour, compare the kid gloves that MSM treats these darkly comic performances from Patel versus the savaging Diane Abbott got. I'm sure all of us at Novara Media and probably everyone watching will, agree with that quite strongly. Also, before we go to our final story, if you are enjoying this show, it is only possible because of our kind supporters. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. You make this possible. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or give us a coronavirus bonus, because there's less money to spend on it. There's less things to spend money on at the moment, and unless you've got completely addicted to getting things delivered to your door. Final story: the revolving door between journalists and the government. So there has long been a revolving door between media and the government, similar to the one that exists between media and corporate lobbyists. So you get people who are the defense secretary who then go on to work for BAE. The problem with it is it affects how you do the previous job. So if you're a defense secretary and you're going to be able to go on to work for BAE, you're more inclined to give BAE good contracts because it sort of gets you in with the right people. And the revolving door that exists between government and media gets talked about less, but it's just important. We're going to go to some historical examples. So in 2011, David Cameron hired the editor of the BBC 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news, Craig Oliver, to be his director of communications. Director of communications is one of the most important jobs in government. In 2012, George Osborne hired the BBC's lead political producer, Thea Rogers, to be his comms chief. In 2017, Theresa May hired the head of political programming at the BBC, Robbie Gibb, to be her director of communications at Number 10. And this weekend, we learned of a new example of this revolving door in action. Allegra Stratton, who is currently national editor of ITV News, has gone into a job as head director of strategic communications for the current Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. Now, I mean, you might think, look, the jobs are similar. One of you is writing about the government and one of you is writing for the government. Well, news, the jobs shouldn't be similar. Holding the government to account, trying to work through government PR and try and, show it for often the complete nonsense it is, shouldn't be the same as writing it. But as we've discussed, obviously, the skill set of Laura Kuenssberg is quite similar to the skill set of the person doing PR for the government, because she kind of just does PR for the government. Also, as I've intimated to before when talking about the revolving door in, other sections of government, is that it creates really poor incentives. Allegra Stratton, she was national editor for ITV News. One of her jobs was to try and show when the government weren't being completely honest. I mean, ultimately, she should have been looking for stories to embarrass Rishi Sunak. And do you think she just woke up one morning and decided, oh, I'm going to, do you think she didn't realize she wanted to go and work for Rishi Sunak until the day it was announced? No, when people are moving on to a different job, they think about that for a while. And so I find it kind of hard to believe that someone who is thinking about going and getting a job high up in government is going to be as willing to write stories which hold the government's feet to the fire and potentially embarrass them as if they weren't. This is insane, isn't it?
I mean, my favorite was when Julia Hartley Brewer tweeted at me saying, well, it's exactly the same as when Seamus Milne left his job at The Guardian to go and work for Jeremy Corbyn, would have been his director of communications. Now, there are some very good reasons for why it's not exactly the same. So, Seamus Milne was associate editor at The Guardian. He openly endorsed Jeremy Corbyn in August of 2015. He later went on to go work for him from October 2015. There's a degree of transparency about Seamus's partisan political affiliations. Been very open about those things for very many years. He was very open about who he endorsed, and then he went to go and work for that person. He never claimed to be an impartial reporter, an editor making, curatorial decisions. He'd moved out of his role as common editor some years before, and he'd never tried to uphold impartial broadcasting standards. The norms that govern newspapers are very, very different indeed. And even if it was the case that he'd been working behind the scenes, trying to secure much more favourable coverage for Jeremy Corbyn from The Guardian in 2015, he did a terrible, terrible job at it. In 2015, The Guardian, of course, went on to endorse Yvette Cooper. So it was completely different. And what you have when it comes to broadcast media, in particular, this revolving door between the BBC and the government, really cushy, top Tory jobs. You also have it to a lesser extent with ITV, with Sky, and also with Ross Kempsell, who, if you will remember, during the general election, no, not the general election, just gone, Boris Johnson's leadership campaign, served him that softball about what do you do in your spare time. Do you remember? And then Boris Johnson said, I paint boxes to look like a bus, like a big, wonderful bus. And he said it kind of, with this strange, dazed look in his eye, like he just popped half his Annex. And then after that softball question, which went viral, Ross Kempsell gets a lovely job working for, who, you guessed it, Boris Johnson. Now, there are a few areas where I think that there should be laws governing what kinds of jobs you can take. But I do think that because broadcasters have to uphold a code of impartiality when it comes to political coverage, in a way that newspapers don't, there should actually be a law preventing you from entering a job with the government or a job with a political party for 2 years after you've left your job in the broadcast media. If you've been working in broadcast media in a senior role, I think that would be a fair law to bring in.
Absolutely. I think the idea that you have someone who is today editing the national news, who could already have a job offer with the government, is just, it's ridiculous that we do not, outlaw that. I also think it's just a bit embarrassing for journalism. I mean, are you committed to journalism as a combative profession, or you're just doing it as a stepping stone to ultimately do PR for the government? Aaron, I know you'll have loads of thoughts on this.
Well, the relationship between the media and the political class should be about, to an extent, predator and prey. And there are very conflicting interests. You want to hold politicians to account. You want to get the real story. Their press people, their public relations people, want to get their side of things across. They don't want necessarily an accurate depiction of what went on. And so there are very competing things going on there. And the frank reality is that in this country, any distinction between public relations and media has sadly broken down. When Andrew Marr wrote a novel, the launch party for it, this is a gentleman who works at the BBC as a very senior journalist, the launch party for it was at number 10 Downing Street. Now, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Who on earth thinks that's a normal, regular thing to do? But seemingly, in the British political media landscape, nobody batters an eyelid. And I think you're right, Michael. It shows, to me, actually, more than anything else, a complete lack of professional integrity and self-respect from the people that go from journalism straight into politics. Now, I get it. You might have political commitments. You might care about a particular candidate. You might want to, maybe I might want to do that one day. I get it. But just doing it so brazenly, particularly as Ash says from broadcast, where you have a public service remit, responsibilities actually is a better way of putting it, and you're rewarded, you're recompensed incredibly well for doing that. To go from that to then serve a politician, I think it's very, very bad. And it just shows a complete lack of any commitment to journalistic values and integrity. This is about getting the story across. Great film recently. I watched The Post on Netflix. Some of the events surrounding Watergate, just sort of preceding it. And these people wanted to get the facts out there about how the United States government, various administrations had lied to the public about what was going on in Vietnam. And if Allegra Stratton and Craig Oliver were operating in those days, they would have made sure those documents were never seen by the public, because they would have said to themselves, you know what? I might want to go work for Richard Nixon next year. Let's keep this out of the public eye. Let's keep on having thousands of American deaths every year, fighting a war we know we can't win, killing Vietnamese people who just want to govern their own country. That's where we are. And as a society, I think the lack of any distinction between media and politics, particularly in Britain, I think primarily because London plays such an outsized role in our national life, is taking us really far backwards really quickly. I think actually a commitment to democratic norms, to media holding politics to account, I think we're far behind where we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's terrifying. Because if you don't think your job is to hold politicians to account, but actually to keep things in your pocket because you might go to work for them next year, what's the point?
Because we're talking about Allegra Stratton, I think it's a useful example of how someone can get ahead in public service broadcasting. And it's not always by holding the government to account, but often by, holding ordinary people to account would be a bad description of the video you're about to see. This is Allegra Stratton in 2012 when she was political editor of Newsnights. This was in 2012, the middle of George Osborne's war on benefit claimants.
Don't you think that you should have possibly lived at home until the point at which you could support your own house?
Well, I find that living at home with my mum just wouldn't be an option really, space-wise. There's not enough space for...
How big's her flat or house?
She does have a 2-bedroom flat.
It doesn't sound to me like your house and your mother's house, your mother's flat, is a bad place. So it's a choice you're making, and it's a choice that comes with a price tag attached.
Yes, it's a choice, but at the same time, I don't think living in my mum's house would have been... It wouldn't have been constructive.
But, we both know people that are living with their parents, they don't have a job, and they have fights. That's what happens, but they don't have a financial choice.
I think that's the difference, because I'm asking for help towards, I'm not asking for a free hand.
So that was Allegra Stratton, privately educated Allegra Stratton, herself married to a Winchester-educated editor of The Spectator, grilling not the politicians who were implementing austerity at that period of time, but the people who were suffering from it. And whilst, that was awkward, I think it was unconscionable, I think it was incredibly out of touch. There's also one other element of that video, which I think makes it an embarrassment to public service journalism, because it was also actively misleading. If you were listening carefully, you'll know that Allegra Stratton at the end said, we know people who aren't working, who live with their parents. She was implying that the person she was interviewing was unemployed. Turns out that was a complete fabrication. And again, this was so clear that Newsnight had to make an apology for that interview. Let's go to that.
And now for an apology. On the 23rd of May, during an item on welfare reform, we broadcast an interview with Shanine Thorpe that unfairly created the mistaken impression that she was unemployed and wholly dependent on benefits, and suggested that she was living off the state as a lifestyle choice. She's asked us to make clear she has been in work or in work-related education since leaving school. Shortly after the programme, we published an apology on our website for the unmerited embarrassment and any distress the item caused her. We're happy to make this broadcast apology as well.
So, national editor at ITV News, that's one of the biggest jobs in public service broadcasting. That is someone who not only humiliated a member of the public, but also, dramatically misrepresented them, right? And that's how you make it in British journalism in the 21st century.
There aren't words for the amount of disgust I feel watching that. And one of the things that I really hate about that era of, war on welfare, a real degradation and humiliation of people who have turned to the welfare state for its very purpose, which is support so you can lead a dignified life when your income isn't able to support you living that dignified life. That they were demonized, that they were seen as, parasites, that they had some kind of moral failing, when we were cutting back on essential public services, which has now come to bite us in the arse in a very big way with this pandemic, because we bailed out the banks, essentially, no strings attached. Not one banker went to prison in the UK for what they did to this country. The city still enjoys light touch deregulation of the kind which I'm sure is about to have some very nasty consequences indeed once we come out of lockdown. You see the kind of crisis and the mess that the finance sector has gotten itself into. And I'm sure that there will be, huge sections of the commentariat, their senior editors, who will be more than happy to be egged on by the government of the day to turn their fire on ordinary people who are marginalized for some reason. Under Cameron and Osborne, it was disabled people and it was benefits claimants. I'm sure that going forward, it's going to be migrants and people who are in low-wage, precarious work, and say that, no, you're the problem. No, the real parasites are the ones who are earning huge sums of money doing public service broadcasting, all the while humiliating and degrading that very public.
I think that point you make about, the situation that woman was in, that's the original purpose of the welfare state, someone who doesn't have a high enough income to live a dignified life. And then that video is such an example of the BBC transforming government ideology into common sense. She was saying, your mum has 2 bedrooms and you're not living in one of those bedrooms, in the same bedroom as your child, presumably. Like, we all know people who are living in one bedroom with their child in their mum's house. Like, do we?
Allegra,
Really?
you don't know someone with a child living at their mum's house. You don't know that person. I mean, maybe you hide them as, your cleaner.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe her cleaner, right?
That's not your mate. That's not your life. God.
I mean, the thing is as well, I said it earlier on the show, these people are complete. I mean, it sounds like I'm just kind of some cliche. They are completely detached from reality. If you go through the public school system, go through Oxbridge, she worked for the BBC, she had that job at Newsnight at a very young age. She's married to James Forsyth at The Spectator. He went to Winchester. They have a very big house in London. She's now at the ITV. It's like you're sort of floating 5-6 feet above in the air. You don't actually have to really engage with the ground. And I mean, for every, I'm not going to make any sort of, strange claims here. We have a nice life. We all went to university and so on. But I think 90%, 95% of the population either has a relative or they experience themselves, they're a very close friend who had a really tough life, right? For years working on minimum wage, whatever. And that experience of knowing someone like that intimately or going through that yourself, they have no idea what it's like. They have absolutely no idea. And the reality is, a few drinks in, they'll be quite candid, I'm sure, many of them, they are almost a different species to us. That is the reality of it. And the way that she was speaking down to that young woman, I mean, it had the class aspect, or I thought it seemed to me, it struck me as an incredibly racialized aspect as well. How could you not be embarrassed and ashamed to be producing that piece of media? And if you don't, so it's so many levels above what I could even comprehend as normal behavior, that you just have to, again, go back and drill down to this thing. Why is the media so screwed up? Because people right at the top literally inhabit a different mental universe to the rest of us. They think all these things are working. Oh, I'll go down Upper Street. Oh, look, all these lovely independent bakeries. Oh, look, my £2 million house. I've got my gym at home. Oh, well, I can afford, care for my kids. My parents are super affluent, haven't got any care concerns about them if they get dementia or need care, care as they get older. That's not normal life for most people. Normal life for most people is really tough. And if you're going to pay people at the BBC big money to do journalism, they have to reflect that. If they're not, it's failing.
I mean, it's people who watched Fleabag and went, that's so me. Oh my God, that's just so me. I mean, your main problems are social anxiety and anal sex. Like, that's so me. So me.
I think that is a very good note to finish tonight's show on. Apologies, we don't have any time for audience questions today, but thank you for your super chat donations and your comments throughout the show. Aaron and Ash, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you both on together tonight. If you have enjoyed the show, please subscribe to this channel. We want to get those subscribers up. We will be live again tomorrow. Aaron will be hosting. You've been watching Titski Sour. I've been Michael Walker. Good night.